for its capacity, connectivity, and resilience. And this has been jointly produced together with a set of consultants led by Adrian Sammons. Ports are the primary modes of in the marine logistics system, and marine transport carries over 80% of the global merchandise trade by volume. And any impediment or friction at the ports will have tangible repercussions for their respective hinterlands, outer island ports, and the communities. The COVID-19 pandemic and the blocking of the Suez Canal by a container ship that ran aground, disruption at the Yantian port had devastating impacts on the global economy last year. The most visible indications of stress in the system are the shortages of certain products and the ships waiting at anchorage outside the major ports and the impact on the cost of goods. These challenges continue to underline the critical role of ports and their associated logistical chains in the global economy. The world economy continues to suffer from a series of destabilizing shocks. After more than 2 years of a pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its global effect on commodity markets, supply chains, inflation, the debt situation, these are all steepened the slowdown in global growth. The World Bank's latest forecast, published 3 months ago, downgraded the economic outlook, with global growth expected to slow sharply to 2.9% this year, from 5.7% in 2021, and an average of 3% during the next 3 years. Intensifying global geopolitical tensions could further disrupt economic activity, and if persistent, it will lead to fragmentation in global trade, investments, and financial systems. Supply chains continued to be affected by the lingering effects of the pandemic, including disruptions in major Asian ports and lockdowns in key cities in China. The repercussions of the Ukraine invasion have led to severe logistical dislocations and have magnified pre-existing bottlenecks. Shortages and unprecedented increases in the prices of key commodities and intermediate goods produced in the two countries have rippled through global value chains, leading to production standstills and elevated producer prices. Although some of these adverse impacts could be mitigated by new trade linkages, a more protracted war and its long-lasting repercussions, such as persistent uncertainty, represent a substantial downside risk to the longer-term trade outlook, and as it could lead to fragmentation in the global trade system. Here again, the ports are expected to be stressed as the trade shifts to new trade lanes and different set of ports, often with limited capacity and connectivity. Hence, it is important for national governments, particularly the Pacific Island countries, and port operators to review the performance of the ports, in particular the container ports, due to the increasing containerized freight movements arising from the proliferation of e-commerce and parcel shipments. Next slide, please. So in our Pacific diagnostics, we have carried out a thorough analysis of the 12 countries. Next slide, please. And we will go through this quickly. Move to the next one. Yeah. So what is striking in Pacific? I think these are information that is already aware to most of the participants. The location of the Pacific, this maritime connectivity network, which is loaded with high logistics costs and at times low efficiency because of the smaller port and the limited port infrastructure, challenges its safety, etc. So it's a fragile system, and also the institutions have the challenge of addressing these issues. Next slide, please. So what did the World Bank and the team do? We scanned the 12 countries in the Pacific to better understand the maritime connectivity sector issues. We've also scanned the outer island ports, how the cargo flows move from the gateway ports into the outer islands, and identified some infrastructure and institutional capacity needs. And how do we develop going forward, help these countries to get connected and properly reduce the logistics cost in the supply chain. Over to you. Over to the next slide. So as I mentioned, we scan the ports for connectivity needs, vulnerability, and what would be the strategic needs in the immediate phase. In the process of developing the infrastructure, how do we bring to the table opportunities for decarbonization, and how can the institutions be strengthened to support this development initiative? So we have these key outputs coming in the next 1 or 2 months. It's in the final stages of preparation. We've also prepared strategic notes for four of the countries whom we thought probably need more attention. And also, how do we plan green port ventures in the Pacific? Next slide, please. Yeah, let's go to the main findings. So what are the findings? What's different? As you all know, there has been a lot of infrastructure developments across the Pacific Islands by many organizations, agencies. So generally, there is sufficient capacity or international shipping connectivity to meet the current needs. Gateway ports are generally of the right size, though some of them would need additional reconfiguration, capacity augmentation, etc. There is, over the years, the governance of the ports have developed. So there is a sort of good regional governance architecture. However, there are plenty of room for further engagement and development. So what needs to be addressed most immediately? What we see, the main gaps are in the domestic connectivity, the connectivity from the main gateway port into the outer islands. Another important need is the need for resilience, strengthening the resilience of the ports to various natural catastrophes, etc. And there has been a lot of infrastructure developed. However, the asset management and the maintenance and operations of the ports could be strengthened. And of course, an increased dialogue at a regional level and also at a national level between the main islands and the outer island provinces. Now, what we need to rethink, there is, as I mentioned in the earlier part, supply chains are shifting. So you have new trade lanes opening. Shipping lines are looking at serving these supply chains. There are new vessels that are being deployed on the main routes. So the size of the vessels that are deployed on the main routes have increased. So as a cascading effect, you can see bigger vessel being allocated for serving the smaller routes. So you have an increase in vessel capacity. Can the ports in the Pacific take it? And when the largest size of the vessels are deployed, is there a way we can better manage the logistics system through a hub and spoke system? Maybe a regional hub, 1 or 2 regional hubs in the Pacific ports, etc. These are questions that our team has pondered on. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I mean, on this particular slide, I think these are familiar information to all the Pacific Island countries. The high cost, lower frequency of the shipping services could be enhanced. There is high probability of disruptions because when the services at the hub ports or the the main supply ports get disrupted, downline supply chain gets disrupted. So is there resilience built in the system? Is there an alternate hub that could take over the distribution through another transshipment port, etc.? So these are some problems and challenges unique to Pacific. I think many of you know this. We can move to the next slide. International shipping connectivity. Currently, there are a few hubs in PNG, in Fiji. Is that the right answer? Could we look at new hubs? Let me bring in at this point our lead consultant, Adrian Sammons, who has extensive experience in operating ships in the region. Over to you, Adrian, and thank you for connecting.
Yeah, thank you, Biju. And again, it's our privilege and honor to participate and make the presentation today to the Pacific Ports Association annual conference. As Biju has introduced, the study undertaken over the last year and a half has been an enormous effort, and it's covered 12 countries in the Pacific, including Papua New Guinea, Solomons, Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, Tuvalu, Kiribati, FSM, Nauru, RMI, and Palau. So a good representation of some of the larger economies and some of the microstates in the Pacific throughout Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. As my colleagues introduced, very ably, the design of the project was undertaken over several different key aspects. And one of those was the connectivity for international shipping throughout the Pacific region. Some of the main opportunities that were discovered is directly associated with the effectiveness and cost of operations, existing capacity, and the future capacity to provide the needs for the Pacific Island countries, frequency or the limitation of frequency to some of the microstates, and some of the oversight mechanisms to monitor the movements in pricing and service levels. So those are some of the key directions and opportunities for future research and perhaps engagement for various other projects. As you all well know, the representation of the association is engaged in providing port services at some of these locations. The key features of the international shipping networks is that the vessels provided into the services are multi-purpose vessels, usually twin deckers with their own ship's cranes, rated capacity of 30 to 50 tons thereabouts, that are used intensively for port operations for ship-to-shore discharge, because of the majority of ports, the absence of shore cranes. There is a couple of ports in the Pacific through the 12 countries that were the assessment that was undertaken, that have installed mobile harbour cranes, and those are in the countries with a larger throughput. The findings were that there was three distinct shipping routes that were operated. The core services, which operate from the Pacific Rim countries, US West Coast, Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, and North Asia, direct to some of the main ports in the Pacific. The second core service is the milk run service, which is those services which operate from the same set of gateway countries, supply countries, to a network of smaller ports, and those routes are generally longer. And then there's the interregional services, which is a relatively new feature that's developed in the last 10 to 15 years, and that's seen the rise of service operations, for example, from Fiji direct to Pacific Island ports. So Fiji's being used as a hub location for distribution to smaller states. There's 8 shipping operators, some of which are in partnerships or joint ventures, and I'm sure the participants in the audience know those shipping lines well. There has been a feature of some mergers and acquisitions over the past 5 to 10 years, whereby some of the larger shipping lines have taken over some of the smaller shipping lines, and there's been a consolidation effect of the number of carriers. The gateway ports. So as we all know, these are typically in Pacific Islands, limited to one main port, and thus the reliance on that gateway port to service the entire nation. Many of the Pacific Island countries are an archipelago state with outer islands lying sometimes hundreds of miles away from the gateway port. Sometimes there's 2 gateway ports, depending on the scale of the countries. This means that there's a lack of port alternatives. So if there is some constraint, limitation in the single gateway port, that will create a bottleneck and a limitation in supply. So there potentially needs to be a workaround or a plan B, another option for supply of port services if the single port becomes unavailable. All of the ports are multi-user facilities, thereby offering both container services, fuel importation, fisheries, domestic transport, and interregional transport at the same multi-user port facility. Generally, the ports are not congested, but because of in most cases, a single key line providing the services to multi-users, and in some ports, cruise shipping is a dominant participant of ship arrivals, which take priority over tanker vessels or container ships, multi-purpose carriers, and thus there are some delays and some inefficiency due to the limitation of supply of key line. Port charges, it's a very good situation to examine this. A lot of the tariffs are legacy tariffs that were taken over at the time of independence of the countries in the late 70s and 80s, and perhaps are not reflective of the true costs of the service provision. This work is ongoing. As Biju introduced earlier, there has been numerous rebuilds and new builds of ports throughout the Pacific countries, and the 12 that we looked at reflect that. However, there is evidence of a build and neglect with limited focus and limited budgets for repairs and maintenance of those assets. So those are the opportunities, and quite succinctly, some of those key development opportunities and research requirements for further understanding and providing assistance is to do with master planning to provide sustainability for the ports, reconfiguration or modernization, asset management, financial sustainability through reform of pricing regimes, involvement of private sector in both provision of port services, stevedoring and management, and a collective regional approach. And I've just realized if I take so long for each slide, we will run out of time. So here's a sample of the gateway ports, and some of which you'll know intimately. And you can see the multi-user aspect at Ponape with the fisheries and multi-purpose carriers. You can see clearly the rebuild of the port in Apia with the extension of the quay line, and you can see the dedicated port in Vanuatu at Port Vila. The legacy of cargo warehouses on wharves occupying large areas and underutilized warehouses is also a feature. Domestic shipping, this was a very key focus of the study, and the critical findings of this is that outer island infrastructure is the poor cousin of the gateway port, and there needs to be development and consistent maintenance and servicing of the outer island ports, jetties and wharves and quay lines to service an essential supply of foodstuffs and materials from the gateway port to the outer islands. Overall safety in domestic shipping needs to be enhanced. The financial sustainability of domestic shipping comes into question. The almost exclusive use of fossil fuels with the domestic fleets in the Pacific Islands, and management of vessels, both the design standards of the vessels selected for operation, and also the repair facilities, either within the host country or within easy distance for repairs and maintenance of vessels, and training within the host countries or within the region of the seafarer workforce is an essential requirement. Safety is a key focus for domestic shipping in Pacific, and there is an increased focus in some Pacific countries, where some countries have recently added a maritime safety authority, but still some countries are lacking and do not have that scale of efficiency as oversight for vessel safety, and there have been recurrent vessel casualties and loss of life. Resilience of the maritime transport sector. The findings are nothing new to the audience. The key findings and opportunities undertaken in the study provide the focus for development, for resilience development, investment in retrofitting and developing with new superstructure and infrastructure and systems, especially to mitigate the exposures at some port sites, the effect of sea level rise, storm surge, and various other extreme weather events, and those which are as a consequence of climate change. The warning systems and collaboration on a regional level between the various host countries' authorities would offer sharing of new developments, as well as including ports that are in developed countries that could provide insights and assistance for best practice. And of course, investment in other resilient measures, including the systems to monitor climate change. This is this is shown a result of the extensive research of the resilience and the criticality of that throughout the 12 countries that were assessed, based on the effect of and a combined effect of the natural hazards of seismic and cyclone and weather events, The 4 ports that were directly at the highest end of the scale adversely affected is Tonga, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa, being the gateway ports, the primary gateway ports in those countries. Another part of the study was a focus on green ports, and this was an in-depth review, an assessment of scorecarding each port in the 12 countries that were assessed based on the indicators that are listed there. The outcomes of the research was that generally there was no baseline monitoring being undertaken at the ports that were researched within the 12 countries. This is a emerging development opportunity, and as the world has advanced in best practice and green port development has occurred around the globe in some of the major ports around the world, Pacific Island ports are just starting to emerge into this campaign. So future monitoring and evaluation is seen as a key development opportunity for developing green ports. The indicators that were assessed demonstrate that there needs to be the motivation for green port development is operational cost reductions at the ports, benefits renewables, whether they be blended finance support or otherwise, or the port funds in themselves. There needs to be a benefit outcome of renewable energy supply to replace that with fossil fuels, and damage recovery also in regard to upscaling green port monitoring and resilience, because natural hazards, seismic and weather events create closures and limitations of the ports. So to mitigate that through a green port campaign would be one of the motivators for ports to become engaged in this aspect. Waste infrastructure was also seen as a priority area. So both waste generated at the port operations as well as waste generated from ship service and operations, both from domestic and from regional and international vessels using the ports. Unfortunately, the ports considered that the waste management in some respects was out of their influence. So there needs to be a paradigm change from a consideration and focus from the ports themselves. And renewable energy was also considered to be out of the sphere of energy, out of the sphere of influence of the ports, but that directly is an opportunity for development. Okay, regional governance and coordination, and as Biju introduced, the governance at Pacific Islands relative to the maritime sector. There is some high-performing governance and oversight of the maritime sector in some of the Pacific countries, mostly within the larger economies. As we cascade through the scale of economies down to the microstates, there's less and less oversight and governance of the maritime sector. Some of that could be further enhanced through regional cooperation, as well as engaging with countries that can provide a best practice solution and assist with providing insights and support, as well as development partners that can provide the necessary blended finance to assist in the resources of technical support. So as we know, the international obligations, covering IMO requirements, is sometimes a burden on Pacific countries, particularly the smaller states, and some of the oversight and obligations do not transfer into the domestic shipping sector. There is there's a long establishment of the required systems and management oversight throughout the Pacific countries, and there is some regional cooperation that already exists, both formally and informally, that we feel needs to be enhanced quite considerably. The overall aim to enhance governance at regional and national levels will provide a better outcome for maritime safety, particularly in the domestic shipping sector, and will also assist in ensuring that the criticality of meeting the obligations under international conventions, which are transferred into international laws, are met, particularly for security, environmental protection, and which will transfer to the efficiency and safety of transport in the maritime sector. There we have a general montage of some Pacific port activity, which is a general scenes. There's no prizes for guessing which port is which, but I'll now pass back to my colleague Biju for a wrap up before we entertain questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian, for your time and also the excellent work that you led in the diagnostics of the ports. We value the inputs from the stakeholders. Unfortunately, this could not happen due to COVID. We were planning to visit each of these 12 ports, have stakeholder engagements. We did a few of the stakeholder engagements online. So we really value your comments. The port associations in each countries are one of the most important and valuable forums for organizations like World Bank that can help in our decisions, in our planning, in our consulting work with the port. So let me hand over back to the organizers. I'm more curious to hear your questions, suggestions as we finalize this report. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any questions from our presenters? I have one. So what actually can you do to help ports? Like, what is the role of the World Bank and all this? Sorry for my ignorance, but.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So the World Bank's the major role, not just limited to financing of the ports, but primarily engaging with the governments and supporting them to develop the master plan on how do we look at ports as a main system to enhance connectivity. So we don't look at straight at the ports, we look at connectivity. So we help and advise and support the governments to make a master plan for connectivity, transport connectivity, and in that, maritime connectivity, and then coming down from maritime connectivity, what kind of vessels are going to be coming to the port, and helping the governments to right-size the infrastructure development based on the emerging needs. So this is a great, one of the most important functions of the bank. Second is we look at institutions. How are the institutions across the countries involved and engaged in the planning of these infrastructure development? How can we strengthen them? What are the best practices and models in developing countries or which has worked better? So we support the institutional strengthening. That's the most core function for people like us. And coming out from the strong institutions and the diagnostics, how do we help the governments draft the right policies, regulations? For example, right now, we have a number of engagements with countries in helping them to transition to low carbon or zero carbon transport connectivity network in the next 5 to 10 years. And then the last but not the least is training. We connect with the best resources in the world. I'm based in Singapore, and we have a number of countries visiting Singapore for capacity strengthening training that would support the overall planning and development of the ports. Thank you.
Good question. Can we get a mic to comment?
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting presentation. As a matter of fact, a lot of your findings, I spoke about tools for assisting facilities engineers with port infrastructure projects, and I saw a lot of commonality in your findings and what we're trying to do with a lot of the potential clients that we have here. With respect to connectivity, can you talk about airports? Because you talked about maritime ports, what's the interplay there? And how does that impact, I guess, options for users for connectivity?
Maybe I could bring in Adrian if you want to comment on the airports. He has got extensive work in transport, unlike me. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. This study we've just presented, as you can see from the montage of photos, focused on the maritime connectivity and the aspects, supporting that. Air transport is an essential part of the network for both freight and passenger movements, both regionally throughout the island networks and internationally. The international movement of passengers, the criticality of air transport is in no doubt for international passenger movement, and that would cater to the majority of passenger movements, if not 100% for international movements. For freight, the ports record year after year. So seaports record year after year that they cater to 99, if not 100% of all freight movements in and out of Pacific nations. So that sort of scalability and comparison sort of demonstrates the requirements of both modes of transport. Air transport between Pacific countries, both regionally and domestically, is a critical part of moving passengers and high value or urgent freight movements such as pharmaceuticals and medical supplies, as well as evacuating for medical purposes. However, aviation, as we all know, as a mode of transport, comes at a very, very high cost. And thus, some of the medium-sized to smaller-sized Pacific nations have limited capacity in both their availability of airstrips and availability of domestic services within their host nation. I could talk a bit more about the diagnostics of aviation versus maritime. And I do hope that has addressed your question.
Maybe just one point to add there. What we saw coming out of the diagnostics is that for the tourism sector, airport network connectivity is the most important. What comes out of the report is that 90% of the tourists use the airlines, unlike compared to cruise vessels. That was a one of the important findings. The cruise traffic is limited. I think 90% of the tourists still uses the airport. So very important point. Maybe one option for the countries is to leverage the revenues from air travel, air traffic, and then channeling it correctly. Thank you.
There's a question out there.
Yes, just one question with regards to some ports. We provide port restrictions for vessels calling through particular ports, like maximum displacement and maximum draft, maximum under review clearance. Is maximum displacement information that is important to be communicated to vessels that calling to ports?
Adrian, if I heard correctly, it was about the maximum draft at the ports and how important it is for Pacific Island countries. Over to you.
Sure, thanks.
Not a draft, displacement, maximum displacement.
Displacement, yeah. So understand. So yes, the research did focus on the capacity of the ports, meaning the capabilities of the gateway ports and domestic ports within each country. This included an assessment of the infrastructure, both the marine land side and also the marine seaside operations, being the channels and the turning basins and the berth pockets and the width and size and depth and so on and so forth. All Pacific ports impose a limitation of some degree, whether it be a depth limitation, a displacement limitation, under keel clearance limitation, so on and so forth. And these are specific and change from country to country. What this translates to is that the shipping providers, the international shipping lines, deploy vessels that have the capability to service a network of ports. So we discovered that there was a Pacific Island Max class vessel. And this is limited to the network of ports that the international shipping lines are servicing. So thus, the smallest port capacity constraint limits the largest size vessel within that network. And by largest, we mean displacement, dead weight, draft, and which directly translates to its carrying capacity of freight. Yeah. So I hope that answers the question.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, we have one more.
Hi, so, you know, I took a look at Wikipedia, and, you know, World Bank is not without some criticism, but can you talk a little bit about the balancing act between what you talked in terms of criteria for financing projects, especially where, you know, just the bonds are low or not viable, as contrasted to what, you know, the People's Republic of China is doing? Because they're being accused of putting a lot of ports like Sri Lanka into debt traps. Can you just talk a little bit about the criteria and that balancing act?
Yeah, that has become an increasing engagement for us. You've hit the right spot. Most of these countries want to develop their port infrastructure. Since I sit in Singapore, and their comparison is the port of Singapore, which handles more than 35 million containers. So a large part of my job is to right size the need of the countries to the potential flows across the trade lanes which are going through their countries. In particular, You mentioned Sri Lanka. We were on the ground in Sri Lanka just at the start of the COVID. We have done a complete diagnostics of the ports in Sri Lanka. We have clearly presented that there is huge overcapacity. And the unique feature of, for example, for Sri Lanka is 85% of their traffic is transshipment traffic. And it is very risky to build ports based on the transshipment traffic, because the transshipment traffic is determined by the shipping lines that chooses the port to transfer cargoes between ships and serve the region. So these are volumes that can move to another port easily. So the ports like Sri Lanka, which handle 85% transshipment traffic, of which large volume was destined to South Asia, countries, particularly India. And as port infrastructure is developed in those countries, the volume of transshipment traffic comes down. And this is directly impacting the volume flows through these ports. So as Adrian mentioned, developing port infrastructure is capital intensive, especially if you look into container shipping. Unlike the other segments, the container ports need to have very strong keys to host the cranes, and each of these equipments are expensive, and most of the ships would be gearless. Ports need to have that infrastructure. So developing a container port is particularly expensive. So our part of our job is to clearly do this diagnostics and inform countries what are the potential scenarios, what are the upside, downside, and how do we bring in the development plan. The second step is port infrastructure development is an area where private sector is active, very active. So it's easy to get financing for a container port if you have a very clear potential and a roadmap for growth. Particularly in the case of Sri Lanka, just before COVID, we were advising the government to sell the government-operated containers terminal to private operators, bring in private operators or a public-private partnership so that the private sector could develop the infrastructure and the facilities. And there were 2 or 3 lines. We did a market sounding, and there were 2 to 3 lines who were interested in developing the terminal. However, the government of Sri Lanka could not make a decision, resulting in the port continuing to be operated and developed by the government with the limited resources. So yes, the first job for us is to do the diagnostics and then advise the governments what are the potential options for financing, particularly private sector financing. And that is the answer to limit the countries from getting into debt situations, etc.
If I could add to that, and it is a fine question, focusing on the support and using World Bank as a benchmark of providing that support. The infrastructure is one campaign and an important one. As equally important is also that opportunities for World Bank and other development partners that can engage and assist in improvements throughout the maritime sector in Pacific Island states is through provision of support to enhance institutional capacity at all levels throughout the departments, marine authorities, safety authorities, port authorities, etc. The building of a safety conscious focus, including a safety economy, particularly for domestic transport. And as mentioned, there's been successive domestic ship casualties involving loss of life, including one most recently last year in a Pacific Island state. So these tragedies can be overcome with support for technical services, institutional capacity building, translation of systems, and technology and support from that side of things as well. Green port development, the benefits are seen, in best practice in global ports, and translating that through with development support to Pacific Islands is seen as a huge benefit. Resilience, protecting structures, infrastructure and superstructure from climate change and seismic, as well as extreme weather events, are also seen as a high priority. So those things in balance with also infrastructure development are seen as those development opportunities that WorldBank and other development partners can engage in, and these are achieved not just through lending funds, but also through blended finance, and as Biju has introduced, also through joint ventures and PPPs, which is another keen focus of WorldBank in approaching private sector within the host countries, within the Pacific countries, and supporting those development opportunities through joint ventures and PPPs. Yeah, thank you, and I hope that adds to Biju's answer.
Jane, are you there?
Hi, yep.